In a church in Rome, there's a piece of wood that's been revered for hundreds of years. It's said to be one of the most important Christian relics ever found. Those who believe in it say it's a piece of the true cross, the cross Christ was crucified on.
For Christianity, it's a very important relic because it was hanging on the cross of Christ. It is an authentic relic of the true cross.
But is this piece of wood really part of Christ's cross? Is there any hard evidence to back the claim, or is it a fantasy?
The idea that all of this is necessarily ridiculous and medieval superstition and so on is something we should just suspend judgment on.
This is the story of one man's attempt to prove that the relic in Rome really is an authentic piece of the cross of Christ. Michael Hesseman is a historian. He specializes in religious history. For years, he's been on a quest. He wants to prove the authenticity of a piece of wood he believes is part of the original cross on which Christ was crucified. The so-called true cross.
It is the most important relic of Christianity because it is a silent witness of the crucifixion of our Lord.
Hesseman is not the first person to make such claims for a piece of wood. For hundreds of years, adventurers have brought back what they claim are samples of the true cross. There are dozens of fragments of wood purporting to be from Christ's crucifixion. But Hesseman believes his relic is very different from all the rest. The relic is housed in a church in Rome known as Santa Croce, or the Church of the Holy Cross. It's called the Titulus Crucis, literally the title of the cross. It's a fragment of a larger piece of wood, which, according to the Bible, was placed above the head of Christ as he hung on the cross. On it are written the words, Jesus of Nazareth, in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Some of the exact words recorded in the Bible.
The Gospel, according to St. John, tells us about the title of the cross, and I quote, "And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
No one questions such plaques were placed above the heads of those crucified. So if Christ died on the cross, he almost certainly would have had one too.
We know from Roman contemporary sources, Roman historians, but indeed, in most cases, the name of a person sentenced to death and the reason for this penalty were mentioned. And in the case of Christ, it was a very plausible inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, which was the name under which he was known. And the crime was to claim to be the King of the Jews.
For Hesseman, it's this inscription on the relic in Santa Croce that makes it so special. It's the only fragment of wood, he believes, with a credible link to the original cross of Christ.
When I saw it the very first time in the Basilica di Santa Croce in Rome, I was fascinated by the possibility that we do have an authentic, important relic going back towards the events in 30 AD, the sentence of Pontius Pilate, the crucifixion of Christ.
If he's right, it's a potential superstar among Christian relics.
If the title is authentic, we have the only surviving relic of the most important court case in history, the case of Jesus of Nazareth, and the potential to be the oldest written record mentioning the name of Jesus Christ.
15 years ago, Hesemann set out to prove its authenticity. Was there any evidence the fragment of wood he could see in Rome had come from the Holy Land? And if there was, how had it travelled 1,500 miles from the Middle East? The quest for answers would take Hesemann on a long and confusing journey. As Hesemann trawled back through the records, he found the first man to look for relics of the true cross was a Roman. In the 4th century AD, the Emperor Constantine had been struggling to unite the Roman Empire under his control.
The empire is vast. It reaches from Britain in the west, it takes in North Africa, it goes up into Middle Europe, it extends over into Turkey and so on. It's vast. It's also highly diverse. It's got peoples from different nations, different ethnic groups, different religions. And so there's always the possibility of revolution or insurrection.
What Constantine needed was a unifying belief system that would pull the empire together. He had found it in the new religion of Christianity.
It's pretty clear that he's seen in Christianity the possibility of a uniting force, something that can give the empire, across its full range, a common identity.
But to give the new religion popular appeal, Constantine needed symbols. One answer was relics, physical objects that could be traced back to Christ himself. For Hesemann, Constantine's search was an obvious place to start his quest. Was there any record that in his hunt for relics all those years ago, Constantine had found the true cross? The trail was nearly 2,000 years old. Hesemann's research led him to the work of a man in Sweden. Stephen Borghammar is Professor of Biblical Studies at the University of Lund in southern Sweden. He's drawn together memoirs and biographies from the time and produced an exhaustive account of Constantine's hunt for relics. They tell how the Roman Emperor's 70-year-old mother, Empress Helena, was sent to find the true cross.
By some accounts, Constantine sends Helena off to look for holy places, for relics of Christ's birth, passion, resurrection, ascension into heaven. By other accounts, it is Helena's own initiative.
Whichever version is true, in AD 325, Helena set off on a major expedition. Borghammar's work enabled Hesemann to trace the journey in some detail.
The journey started near Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. And if they had taken the land route, they would have gone basically from north to south in present-day Turkey, passing through the Taurus Mountains. And then they would have gone along the coast, basically down to Caesarea, and then by some route up to Jerusalem.
It was a journey of over 700 miles. It would have been tough going for somebody half Helena's age.
It's a long journey, a difficult journey, partly an uncertain journey. And of course, she's not exactly sure what she's going to find when she gets there. So I think we must assume that whatever else may be the case, she's a pretty impressive figure.
Helena's journey in pursuit of relics would be celebrated in paintings and murals. It took her several months. Helena finally arrived in Jerusalem. Here, one of the first places she looked for was the site of Christ's crucifixion.
She asks around. She asks the Christians. She asks some Jews. She asks some Romans. She asks whoever she can. What do we know about this? What's the narrative? Where was the Lord crucified?
She soon learned Christians were already venerating the symbol of Christ's crucifixion, the cross.
From early Christianity onwards, we find traces of the veneration of the cross. We find crosses inscribed on Christian ossuaries in Jerusalem. We found indications that the cross was a sacred symbol of Christianity from the very beginning.
But were there any physical remains of the original true cross? According to popular legend, Helena soon found a man who appeared to know where fragments were buried. But he wouldn't tell. So Helena, in the fashion of the day, ordered him tortured.
She puts him at the bottom of a well for a whole week without food, and then he softens and he says, "Okay, I'll show you the spot."
He took her to what was believed to be the site of the crucifixion. As Hesseman traced the story, he discovered Helena had found a Roman temple to Venus on top of the site.
Helena gives the instruction that the existing Roman temple is to be demolished and that excavations are to begin in search of the site of Christ's crucifixion. So she digs down and she finds a cistern, an area that was part of the water system but long ago dried up. And she finds the remains of 3 crosses.
Three crosses, identical to the account in the Bible which relates that Christ was crucified alongside 2 thieves. For Helena, it must have been a big moment, but also a puzzling one. How could she tell which was the wood of Christ's cross? Digging through records, Hesseman found the answer in an account written at the time. It came from a man known as Ambrose of Milan.
Ambrose of Milan was one of the most highly regarded bishops in the Christian world, in the Mediterranean world, in his lifetime.
Ambrose records that Helena had found among the pieces of wood a vital clue. She hadn't just found beams of wood. Attached to one cross was the Titulus Crucis, the piece of wood said to have hung above Christ's head.
The account in Ambrose is fairly detailed, telling the whole story of Helena finding the cross and mentioning also that the Titulus was found together with it.
Hesseman then found a second corroborating account.
More or less at the same time as Ambrose, a church father called John Chrysostom, who was the bishop of Antioch, mentions this event. He says that the authenticity of the cross was proved because the Titulus was still attached to it, it was sticking to it.
This is what Hesseman was looking for. Here was clear evidence that Helena had found the original true cross. And the proof was she'd also found the Titulus Crucis, the piece of wood Hesseman could see in the church in Rome.
As a historian working with the original sources, I have no doubt at all that the finding of the true cross under St. Helena in Jerusalem in 325 AD was a historical fact. Indeed, the Titulus helped her to be sure that these pieces of wood found were indeed remains and relics of the crucifixion of Christ and not just of any other crucifixion.
But is any of this story really true? Had Helena even been to Jerusalem? One piece of proof was a very solid celebration of her achievement. To mark the site of her success in finding the true cross, she built a church. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Today, it's one of Jerusalem's most visited and important holy places. Hesseman had traced the first link in his hunt to prove the authenticity of the Titulus Crucis. He'd found strong evidence for its discovery. The next task was to find the link between Helena's discovery and the fragment of wood in Rome, over 1,000 miles away. Hesseman worked his way through the various accounts. He discovered that soon after finding the cross, Helena had divided the relics.
The early church historians mention that the findings were divided, that she sent a part of the wood of the true cross, a part of the nails, she found 3 nails, to her son in Constantinople. A part remained in Jerusalem, and the third part was taken to Rome.
One of the best witnesses to this distribution of relics was Cyril, the 4th century bishop of Jerusalem.
Cyril of Jerusalem mentioned in a letter that the true cross was divided in so many parts that it filled the earth, the face of the earth.
Hesseman found 4th and 5th century records of the true cross reaching Gaul, North Africa, Asia Minor, and Syria. And he also found something that would prove critical to his quest. Helena had not just divided up the wood of the cross. She'd also cut up the Titulus Crucis itself, simply chopped it into several pieces. Exactly how many bits remains uncertain. But there's a good account of what became of at least one piece in Jerusalem. Some 60 years after Helena's triumph, it was seen by a Spanish pilgrim. She was called Egeria.
She tells how on one particular day there was a celebratory event in which a box was produced. The Bishop of Jerusalem, assisted by some presbyters, or we might now think of kind of priest figures, attended this. The box was open, and revealed within it were parts of the cross and the Titulus itself.
Egeria says she has seen it, and she is, generally speaking, a good witness to things and persons and events. She seems to be very reliable.
Here was further proof the true cross had been found and had survived. But Hesemann also found something else. Helena had kept one piece of the relic for herself. Hesemann now made another crucial link in the story. In Rome, he found accounts that suggested Helena had brought some of the relics home with her.
When St. Helena returned to Rome, she brought 3 relics, a large fragment of the 2 cross, half of the Titulus Crucis, and one of the nails found.
It seems Helena never intended these relics for public display. They were destined for her private palace. In the second half of the 4th century AD, Helena died. Her sarcophagus is in St. Peter's in Rome. It's decorated with highlights from her life. She was canonized and is often depicted with a cross. Hesemann had completed the next link in his quest. He had traced the Titulus from Jerusalem to Rome. But at this point, the trail gets murky. What had become of the relic after Helena's death? Hesemann now needed to find new sources of evidence. He turned to church records in Rome. Here he found that Helena had donated her relics, including the Titulus Crucis, to the Pope, Sylvester I.
When St. Helena died, she passed on in her testament her palace with everything which was in it, including her private chapel and the relics.
Several years after her death, the Pope built a new church on top of her palace. He called it the Church of Santa Croce, or the Holy Cross.
If you go to Rome, you can still see the walls of the Roman palace incorporated into the basilica.
But as Hesemann searched further, the records were tantalizingly vague. There seemed to be no mention of the relics themselves. Then the story became even more confused. Reading through church records, Hesemann found that 800 years after Helena's death, in the 12th century, the Church of Santa Croce had undergone extensive restoration. But again, the records made no mention of the relics, or even if they still existed. The trail seemed to have gone completely cold. But then, there was a breakthrough. Checking church archives, Hesemann came across an account dating from 1492 of repair work on the ceiling of Santa Croce.
In the part which originally was the chapel, the private chapel of Sancta Helena, they removed the mosaics which were falling down and found a brick with an inscription, Titulus Crucis. Of course, they removed this brick, and behind they found a box. They removed it, they found a seal of a cardinal from the 12th century, from 1144. And they broke the seal. They opened it and they found the piece of wood with the inscription in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth. The fragment of the Titulus Crucis, the fragment of the inscription of the cross.
It was an extraordinary discovery. The first confirmed sighting of the Titulus Crucis for over 1,000 years. Hessemann now put together what must have happened. When the church had been restored in the 12th century, the relics must have been packed away in the roof, where they'd remained until their discovery in 1492. Hessemann was back on the trail of the Titulus. Or was he? The discovery raised another question. If it was genuine, why would one of the most important Christian relics of all time remain hidden in the roof of a chapel? Hessemann puzzled over what might have happened at Santa Croce. Finally, he came up with an answer.
In the early Middle Ages and late Antiquity, it was normal not to expose relics for public veneration, but to hide them in the walls of a church, because they believe that it sanctifies the entire church.
In Hessemann's judgment, the very fact that the Titulus Crucis had remained hidden away lent it even greater authenticity.
Who is creating a complicated fake to hide it in a wall? Not to expose it, not to show it, not to tell people, look what we have, to attract pilgrims during the holy years in Rome. Not to collect donations from the pilgrims, not to expose it for public veneration, but to hide it in a wall. This doesn't make sense at all to me.
Whatever the truth, Hessemann found that in 1492, the church authorities put the Titulus Crucis on public display, where it's remained ever since. Hessemann had successfully linked the Titulus Crucis in Rome back to the Holy Land. Yet some links in the story were still uncertain. In particular, the link between the Titulus arriving in Rome and its discovery by workmen in the 15th century was weak. What he needed was definitive evidence that would link the relic in Rome with Helena's discovery of it, 1,200 years earlier. Hessemann now embarked on a close scrutiny of the fragment of the Titulus itself.
The Titulus Crucis is a piece of brown nutwood, 25 by 14 centimeters in size, 700 grams in weight. And it is obviously the right-hand corner of something bigger, because we have a high degree of decay on the top on the right and the lower side, but a very clear cut on the left.
That cut was crucial. It matched exactly the account of Helena cutting up the Titulus Crucis. Hessemann then looked at the text. It was written, like Hebrew, from right to left. This suggested it might well have been inscribed by a native of Jerusalem.
It has 3 lines of inscription in Hebrew, in Greek, and in Latin, all giving the same information, Yeshu Hanozri, I.Nazarenus, I.Nazarenus, the name of Jesus of Nazareth.
The colouring was also typical of the Roman era in Palestine.
The letters have remains of black color inside, and the brown wood was covered with the remains of white chalk. So obviously it was originally black and white. And this is typical for Roman wood tablets in general. They make the colorization so it's better readable.
But it was the words on the Titulus Crucis that particularly attracted Hesemon's attention. There are 2 biblical accounts of the words on the Titulus. The first comes from the Gospel of Luke. He says the order was Greek on top, then Latin, then Hebrew. The second account comes from the Gospel of John. He reports the order as Hebrew first, then Latin, then Greek. But the order on the actual Titulus is different from both. It goes Hebrew, then Greek, then Latin. This was the first puzzle. More puzzling still, there were variations in the spelling of the word Nazareth.
In all Latin translations of the Gospel according to John, it is written Nazarenus, but here on the Titulus it is written Nazarenus, with an I instead of an E.
For Hesemon, these errors were highly significant.
No forger would ever make spelling mistakes in a forgery.
They led him to conclude they were vital clues that proved the authenticity of the Titulus Crucis.
There are too many freedoms, there are too many differences from the information we have in the Gospel. No forger would take the freedom to change the spelling, to change the order, even to write from right to left. This all indicates that it was a spontaneous creation and not an elaborated fake. And that's why I believe it was indeed the original inscription of the cross of Jesus of Nazareth.
In other words, for Hesemon, the very fact that the writing on the Titulus was different from the version in the Gospels proved it was authentic. A forger would never make such basic mistakes. But that left one final question. Could an inscribed piece of wood really have survived nearly 2,000 years? The answer came, unexpectedly, from Roman remains in Britain, Hadrian's Wall. In 1973, archaeologists digging at the Roman fort of Vindolanda found nearly 2,000 handwritten tablets made of slivers of wood. They dated from the time of Christ. They had been beautifully preserved in waterlogged soil where there was almost no oxygen present. Oxygen encourages decay. The conditions were almost identical to those in which the Titulus Crucis is thought to have been found.
You can ask if a piece of wood can survive 2,000 years, and the answer is of course. Especially if the tradition is true, that the remains, that the 3 crosses were found in an old cistern.
Hesemon now had at least 5 clues that in his judgment pointed to the Titulus being authentic. First, the evidence from Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, appeared to confirm Helena had dug up the Titulus Crucis in Jerusalem. Second, the record from Cyril of Jerusalem suggested she divided the relics and distributed them across the world. Third, the fact that it had been hidden during the Middle Ages suggested it was the real thing. Why hide a fake? 4. Variations between the wording on the actual titulus and the accounts in the Gospels again pointed to its authenticity. No forger would risk such blatant errors. And now, finally, evidence from Hadrian's Wall suggested a wooden tablet with writing on it could, under the right conditions, survive 2,000 years. For Hesemann, the evidence was now overwhelming. The titulus in Rome was authentic. He had found a relic of the true cross. Hesemann took his findings to the highest authority.
I found it a relevant discovery for the Christian faith, and that's why I presented it to Pope John Paul II.
History doesn't relate what the Pope's response was, but a number of senior Christians are prepared to give Hesemann's Titulus Crucis at least the benefit of the doubt.
If we ask ourselves the question, what relics might have survived from the crucifixion, it's in fact highly likely that among those would have been this title that was put upon the cross. It's so important as identifying the figure of Jesus that it's very likely that it would have been preserved, and of course it was very easy to remove and take away. So the idea that all of this is necessarily ridiculous and medieval superstition and so on is something we should just suspend judgment on.
But are they right? So far, all Hesemann's evidence had either been a paper trail or had relied on basic archaeological techniques. Could hard scientific scrutiny now back this up? The investigation was about to take a new twist. In 2002, a laboratory at the University of Rome conducted radiocarbon dating tests on the Titulus Crucis. If it was authentic, it should date from around 30 AD.
They took 6 samples from the back of the Titulus Crucis. You do a level of pre-treatment that should get rid of any contaminant carbon from the sample.
After this decontamination, the tiny pieces of wood were analysed for their radiocarbon-14 content to discover their age.
They also analysed other samples of known age as confirmation that the accuracy and precision was fine. And they came up with a consensus value that was significantly different from what you would have expected.
The conclusion was unequivocal.
When the radiocarbon age was calibrated, it gave a calendar age range of 890 to 1150 AD, and that's with 95.4% probability.
In short, the relic in Rome dated from the Middle Ages, 900 years after the death of Christ. It could not be part of the true cross. But for some, this is not the end of the matter. They argue carbon dating has been wrong before. One of the most famous controversies was in the 1980s. In 1988, samples of the Turin shroud were tested for their age. The shroud is a piece of fabric bearing an apparently 3D image of a Christ-like human face. Legend says the cloth was placed over the face of Jesus after his crucifixion and miraculously picked up his image. When samples of the shroud were sent to 3 different laboratories for radiocarbon dating, the results suggested it was a medieval fake.
The results were comparable between the 3 laboratories and gave an age range of 1260 to 1390 AD with a 95.4% probability that the true age lies within that span. Now that's not to say that the other 5% is way out of that span.
Yet a number of people, few of them scientists, have challenged the finding. They believe there were fundamental problems with the sample. It was contaminated.
The shroud has a vast history. People have gotten their fingers all over it. Artists have copied it. There's been paint dropped on it. It's been in countless numbers of chapels and so on, with all that atmosphere there. It's been through a fire, at least one we know of, and doused with water. The fire was so hot that it melted the metal casket that the shroud was in. So all of these are tremendous contaminants.
They argue that problems like these have discredited carbon-14 testing, certainly in the case of the shroud.
Carbon-14 is certainly valid and a good procedure along with other procedures, but it certainly also can be wrong, as in this case, in my opinion. It was botched.
Most scientists dispute this challenge. But similar arguments about contamination are now raging around the Titulus Crucis. For Hessemann, the carbon dating results are simply not credible.
When I learned about the result of the carbon dating, claiming to be a forgery from the Middle Ages, it was clear for me that it has to be wrong. We know that carbon dating is only reliable in 75% of the cases, but there's a 25% margin of factors which cannot be controlled, factors of contamination and conditions we do not know.
In particular, Hessemann believes there will have been carbon contamination from candles and human breath. These more recent carbon deposits would, he argues, have built up, impregnating the ancient wood. That in turn could have led to a false reading in the carbon dating tests. But Gordon Cook, a recognized expert in carbon dating, profoundly disagrees.
The idea that 25% of all radiocarbon tests are wrong is quite preposterous. You could argue that the smoke from the candles could have embedded itself in the wood, but when the pre-treatment that was undertaken should have removed virtually all of that.
Yet Hessemann has now dismissed all carbon dating tests of the Titulus Crucis. He believes he's found a much more reliable alternative form of dating. It's a method that draws on changing styles of handwriting. It's called comparative paleography.
This method is accepted in history because people changed the way of writing during the ages. If you have a letter written by your granny during World War II, the handwriting is different from the handwriting of people today.
Comparative paleography argues that the writing style of one period is not only different from another, but during any one period there is a clear uniformity of style. So a medieval text will always look different from a piece of copperplate writing, which in turn could never be mistaken for a 19th century piece of writing. Hessemann sent photographs of the text on the Titulus Crucis to a number of experts.
I presented copies of the Titulus Crucis to 7 experts on comparative paleography of 3 different universities in Israel.
The experts examined the Greek, Hebrew, and Latin texts. They all, apparently, came to the same conclusion.
All of them, experts on Latin, Greek, and Hebrew paleography in the Holy Land, scholars who worked with the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated it into the 1st century, the time of Christ.
But is comparative paleography really more reliable than carbon dating? For over 60 years, scientists have used carbon-14 tests to date ancient artifacts, from Egyptian pyramids to medieval church relics. It has consistently proved reliable.
Radiocarbon dating has a scientific basis. We can calculate an age on an object. If you take paleographic techniques, it would be possible to forge an earlier writing style on a piece of wood to make it look like the Titulus Crucis.
Yet Michael Hesseman is unmoved.
We have not a single case where comparative paleography is wrong, where people in the Middle Ages prove that they were able to write like people wrote 1,000 years before. If I, as a historian, have the choice between 2 methods, comparative paleography and carbon dating, I trust comparative paleography.
There, for now, the matter rests. To most scientists, the evidence from carbon dating makes it highly unlikely that Titulus Crucis is part of the true cross. But that won't stop some people believing in it. To many Christians, the idea that Christ's cross has survived is just too powerful an idea.